To determine here means to endow with a particular sense. The expression a real relation clearly means something like the relation that obtains between a proper name, a name which is proper singularly and exclusively to this or that singular entity, and that entity. So a dynamic object is singular. It is capable of bearing a proper name. It is determinate and determinable, and it also determines the sign that designates it. We might then say that the index and the object stand in a relation of reciprocal determination that no other sign maintains with its object. We will also remark that although for Peirce dynamism is a property of the dynamic object, it is also a property of the indexical sign. This is the real relation that obtains between the two. The real relation between the index and the dynamic object is itself both an index and a dynamic object. This arrangement, as I say, will be difficult on its face. Its importance may seem minor, a scholastic matter to be debated ad nauseum among academics. And in any event, how does this confusing notion of a dynamic object help us to understand what Marx means by an object? Of course, no definition that puts into relation the terms determination, a real relation, and dynamis, power, is likely to be trivial at core. Turn with me to the second matter. When I say that Marx's objects are dynamic, I introduce a third term, the relation between these two sorts of objects. And I am saying that this relation, inasmuch as it is dynamic, is the real concern of Marx's system. The Greek word dynamos, power, is an unsettled concept, and Peirce is playing on it, as am I. The unsettlement is clearest if we look at the Latin translation of the Greek word dynamis, a term we find already in Aristotle, and which, over time, finds its way to popular usage as the prefix to dynamite into the lost worlds of the film Jurassic Park that are hinged onto the noun dinosaur, dynos, and of course the name for the class of machines that serve to produce power, dynamo. But the Greek word dynamis becomes in Latin potentia, and in Latin it carries two explicit senses. Potentia may mean power, and here it is synonymous with the Latin potestas, most often referring to sovereign power. But it also may mean possibility or potentiality, as when we say that water is potentially ice, snow, steam, or flowing water. As power, potentia and dynamis mean power in act or effectivity. Potentia may be a quality of an object or of an entity, but it is an actualized quality. It exists inasmuch as it is always already actualized. Its horizon is the event. Not so the second notion, the second sense of potentia. Potentiality, in this sense, excludes the event. Its relation to actuality and to actualization, to what Aristotle calls entelecheia, is a relation of mutual exclusion. A complicated mutual exclusion that is also a correlation. You cannot imagine potentia as potentia without the possibility, the potentia at another level, of the actualization of what was potential. This is difficult to translate. Difficult in English. It must be possibly difficult in Chinese. You cannot imagine potentia as potentia without the possibility, the potentia at another level, of the actualization of what was potential. But inasmuch as that actualization is the completion or the eventual and imminently determined outcome of potentia, then potentia is erased or subsumed in its actualization. It ceases to be. As soon as water takes the form of snow or ice that it has potentially, the potentiality for that bit of water to be other than snow or ice has disappeared. Notice that the claim has changed slightly, since I'm now making a statement about a particular bit of water or about that bit of water rather than a definitional claim regarding all water or the concept of water. In this sense, dynamis is both a form of radical passivity and a potentiality oriented toward the event in which it disappears. Now, that was about dynamis or dynamism. As to my other term, the term object. When I refer to Marx's objects, I mean two things, roughly corresponding to physical objects in the world of the senses on one hand, and on the other to the conceptual or even the logical objects that form the core of Capital and of Marx's writings on political economy. Like the notion of power, potentia or dynamis that we found in Peirce's the word dynamism, the distinction between physical and conceptual or logical object is likely to prove a little hazy. Indeed, the philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein rejects the idea that the term object is at all a concept. Instead, and precisely because the term object straddles the incompatible uses of ordinary language and formal languages, Wittgenstein calls object a pseudo-concept, or rather an apparent concept, or the illusion of a concept. The word he uses in German is Scheinbegriff. The prefix term Schein, appearance, is most often in the tradition that Wittgenstein is writing in, used in opposition to what is real. Shine is what is merely shining. It is what merely shines. It is the mere appearance of a thing. It is what is merely apparent. For Wittgenstein, the group of words that we've mentioned and regard as roughly synonymous, the terms for object, Objekt, Gegenstand, Ding, Sache, as well as terms that refer to the combination of these terms that refer to abstract descriptions of primitive terms, words, Wittgenstein says, like Komplex, Tatsache, Funktion, and Zahl, that is to say, complex, fact, function, and number, these words too, Wittgenstein says, are Scheinbegriffe, illusory or merely apparent pseudo-concepts. Both sorts of words are used both as ordinary language semantic tokens and as what Wittgenstein calls formal concepts, to be designated by variables, nomen, like the letter X. The sort of logical formalism that the early Wittgenstein advocates takes objects to be such signs, nomen. It is a double defect in terms like object, in the term object, especially the most primitive and, as Frege says, unanalyzable of terms, that its everyday usage appears to grant it real-life qualities. Here's an example. The magnificent blue dome of the British Library's round reading room. We picture Marx at work on the Grundrisse, debating with Ricardo's texts, mooching as usual on Jenny's work and inheritance to live rather miserably. It is late summer or early fall of the year 1857. He is trying to understand how to replace the unimaginative fantasies of 18th century romances a la Robinson Crusoe, fantasies in which Homo Faber is imagined as the solitary and isolated hunter or fisherman, and which serve Adam Smith and Ricardo as a starting point. In place of these fantasies, Marx proposes a point of departure located instead in individuals producing in a society, and hence the socially determined production of individuals. The starting point given by the unimaginative fictions of bourgeois economics corresponds, in the idiom of the discipline of political economy, to a fantastical scene. I'll now read it to you in English now. Production, he says, is simultaneously consumption as well. It is consumption in a dual form, subjective and objective consumption. Firstly, the individual who develops his abilities producing expends them as well, using them up in the act of production. Just as in natural procreation, vital energy is consumed. Secondly, it is consumption of the means of production, which are used and used up in part, as for instance fuel, are broken down into simpler components. It similarly involves consumption of raw material which is absorbed and does not retain its original shape and quality. The act of production itself is thus, in all its phases, also an act of consumption. The economists concede this. They call productive consumption both production that is simultaneously identical with consumption and consumption which is directly concurrent with production. The identity of production and consumption amounts to Spinoza's proposition determinatio est negatio. Before asking whether this assertion of Marx's makes sense, before asking in what respect these two phrases come together, Marx's paraphrase of the foundational proposition of primitive economics on one hand, and on the other Spinoza's proposition determinatio est negatio, note the three sorts of identity that run together in Marx's famous text at obviously different levels of analysis. First, the identity of production and consumption in the portmanteau concept that classical economics calls productive consumption. Second, the identity of determination and negation. And third, most mysteriously, the identity on which the relation between these two hangs. The first comes next to kommt hinaus the second, auf the second, Marx writes. These two forms of identity amount to one another. They come to about the same. One usually says in German, das kommt auf dasselbe hinaus, or auf eins or aufs gleich. The identity that mediates and determines the relation, the hinauskommen of the first two. The identity apparently allowing these two forms of identity to be translated into one another. That conveyed by a certain name, a Name in German, the name Spinoza. But what sort of thing is a name? This is what Marx means when he refers to the identity, the Identität of consumption and production. Two dissimilar things, objects or concepts, are shown or made to be the same, identisch. And this new thing, this new object or concept that they are, is an identity, an Identität. From this point forward, from the mythic point at which this identity, call it productive consumption, is named, it stands forth distinct from each of its elements. Marx's Identität is deeply and controversially at the same time a process or a relating term and the name for the outcome of that process. In English, we would want to say that Marx's Identität means both the identifying of consumption with production, or of determination with negation, or of Spinoza's Satz with the first two. It means that, and also the singular result of that dynamic process, the object, concept, or thing that we'd call a new and distinct identity. It is an event and a substance. What sort of thing is a name, I asked. For instance, the composite name productive consumption. How do we go about naming an object? Do we derive or borrow an identity, for instance, a professional or a class identity, from the names that we give things, from our naming? Economists are those subjects who can give the name productive consumption to this or that concept, corresponding to an abstract object and having some sort of real existence, and then take from that naming their thisness, Peirce might say, their distinctness from other subjects, borrowing from naming and from the concept object thing named a continuous identity and forcefulness, Peirce says. The questions have a distinctly scholastic ring in their more general form. The competition between the principle that res sunt consequentia nominum, things are the result of names, and nomina sunt consequentia rerum, names result from things, is fought on pages and in halls from Justinian's time forward. This debate between the two ways of thinking about the relation between names and things, names produce things, things produce names, is an antique problem in Western philosophy. It goes back to the beginning. Remark what we stand to gain if we keep our names and our acts either happily separate, if we keep our identities at a distance from our identifications, or decidedly and perspicuously linked to one another. Identifying this or that couple of concepts, things and objects is what we do. It's our thing. It's our identity. In other words, what we gain by embracing a classic conception of identity, which allows us both alternatives. The things we grasp by means of a name we give an object will remain to hand from one moment to the next, under this classic idea of identity. We will collect for and about these things lists of qualities or of predicates, determine these to be definitive or accidental, distinguish these things from others on the ground that some possess, some do not, a minimal clutch of definitive qualities, defend the endurance or the perdurance of our things. We will embrace as a token of the strength of this classic conception of identity the necessary circularity of our procedure. The things we handle are possessed of qualities and of a temporality we deem to be essential, but we identify these things in the first place as those things that possess these qualities. The objects of our discipline, the objects our discipline names, will be identical across time. Our discipline will borrow from that identity across time its own perdurance, as we will borrow from our discipline our who and our what. By things we will mean an apple, or this table, or that bale of cotton, or Robinson Crusoe, but also such mental things as consumption, production, or the identity of production and consumption, or the primitive fantasy of an original pre-social homo economicus. A classic conception of identity furnishes us with a self-evident, common-sense fantasy that a potato is, after all, a potato. A table is a table, over time and to all effects. It provides us, step by step, essential quality aggregated to essential quality with the fantasy of an eventual identity between species and social being. It lets us assert that the proper name, Spinoza, designates something or someone rigidly, the same thing, across all possible worlds, and would be unintelligible otherwise, and that whatever the name Marx designates across possible worlds can bear different descriptions and determinations in those worlds. In some of these possible worlds, Marx is the author of a work called The Road to Serfdom. For instance, he's not really the author of that work, as you know. So that's what we gain on one side. Now, remark what we lose when we keep our names and our acts either happily separate or decidedly and perspicuously linked to one another. Remark what we lose by embracing a classic conception of identity. When I refer, as Marx's text does, to the identity of production and consumption, I will have to mean not this particular identity of two abstract terms, or contingent identifications of this sort available in any case for abstract terms. I will have to mean the general, the identity of production and consumption furnished by the standard English translation. The indexicality of identity propositions fades, and with it a specific sort of difference tied to the act and moment of enunciation, to the modal or verbal aspects of the phrase, to my identifying this term with that, here and now, under modal aspects and in circumstances liable to change.